He said, I'll love you till I die.
In 1980, a man once hailed as country music's greatest voice was found wandering the side of a frozen Nashville highway, muttering to himself, barely recognizable. He had lost it all, his fortune, his reputation, and nearly his life. But in just 2 years, he would deliver a song that would cement his place in music history forever. This is the story of George Jones, a man whose voice could shake the soul, but whose demons nearly destroyed him. From a poverty-stricken shack in Texas to the biggest stages in America, his life was a whirlwind of brilliance and self-destruction. He sang with more heartache than anyone because he lived it. His rise was unstoppable. His fall was catastrophic. And yet, when the world thought he was finished, he clawed his way back to leave behind a legacy that would never fade. This is the untold story of country music's most troubled, most gifted, and most unforgettable legend. Before the world knew his name, before the sold-out shows and #1 hits, George Jones was just a poor boy from East Texas, living a life that seemed destined for struggle. Born in 1931 in Beaumont, he came into a world that was already hard. The Great Depression loomed over every household, and in the Jones family, survival came before comfort. His father, a heavy-drinking pipe fitter, found his only joy at the bottom of a bottle and in the sound of his son's voice. From the time he could stand, George was handed a guitar and told to sing. Not for fun, not for praise, but because if he didn't, there would be consequences. His father would sit him down, demand song after song, and if he got tired, he was reminded, sometimes with a belt, sometimes with a backhand, that he was born to entertain. It wasn't love that pushed him to sing, it was fear. But music became more than just survival. It was an escape. When his father would pass out, the house quiet, George would sneak to the family radio, turning the dial to the voices that would shape his world. Roy Acuff, Hank Williams, Lefty Frizzle, these were his first teachers. He didn't just listen, he studied, memorized every break, every yodel, every ache in their voices. By the age of 7, he wasn't just mimicking them, he was learning to put his own pain into song. At 9 years old, he took that voice to the streets, playing on corners, outside bars, anywhere someone might toss him a dime. A local radio station gave him a Saturday morning slot, a 15-minute show where he'd sit on a wooden stool, his guitar bigger than he was, belting out the songs of his idols. The station manager took note, scribbling in his logbook, "Kid's got a voice that don't match his size." Sounds like a man already lived a lifetime of hurt. But hurt is exactly what he'd come to know. At 14, he'd had enough. He ran away, hopping from town to town, taking whatever work he could find, washing dishes, mopping floors, singing for meals. But no matter how far he went, music was the one thing he couldn't outrun. At 17, he found himself in a recruiter's office, signing up for the Marines. A boy who had spent his life running had suddenly committed himself to something bigger. Stationed in California, he found himself in the middle of a different kind of war. A war between old country and a new kind of honky-tonk. Bars blared with electric guitars, rougher voices, songs about hard luck and harder drinking. This wasn't the country music of his father's radio. This was something wild, something raw. And for the first time, George felt like he belonged. By 1953, he was back in Texas, a Marine no longer but a singer still searching for his place. That's when fate led him to Pappy Daly, a record producer who didn't just hear talent, he knew how to turn it into money. Pappy wasn't fooled by George's rough edges. He saw the hunger, the pain, the voice that could cut through a crowd like a knife. And more than anything, he saw the potential for something great. He signed George to Starday Records and threw him into a makeshift studio, a back room behind a radio station where the soundproofing was blankets nailed to the walls. There was no glamour, no luxury, just a microphone and a boy who had spent his life preparing for this moment. His first recordings were raw, unpolished, but in every note, there was something undeniable. A voice that didn't just sing country, it bled it. The road to fame wasn't easy. The bars, the honky-tonks, the endless miles between shows. And with the fame came something else, a growing addiction. What had once been a drink to calm his nerves before a show became a necessity. A way to drown out the demons still whispering in the back of his mind. Then came the song that changed everything. White Lightning. A wild, raucous anthem about moonshine and rebellion. The recording session was infamous. 83 takes. A battle between George's voice and the whiskey in his bloodstream. The producer nearly walked away. But then, on that final take, something clicked. George Jones didn't just sing White Lightning, he owned it. And when it hit number 1 in 1959, the world took notice. George Jones wasn't just another country singer anymore. He was a star. With stardom came a new name. The industry took one look at his sharp features, those close-set eyes, that upturned nose, and gave him a nickname, the Possum. At first, he hated it, said it made him sound like roadkill. But as the years went on, he came to embrace it. Because like a possum, no matter how many times life knocked him down, he always found a way to come back. Through the early 1960s, the hits kept rolling in. Tender Years, She Thinks I Still Care. Songs that didn't just tell stories, they ripped open wounds. George had perfected something few artists ever could. The cry break. That split-second catch in his voice that could send shivers down a listener's spine. It wasn't just a gimmick. It was real. When George sang about heartbreak, you felt every ounce of it. But behind the curtain, the man who sang about heartbreak was living it. His drinking was getting worse. The same passion that fueled his music was destroying his life. The bar fights, the no-shows, the missed recording sessions, George Jones was becoming as famous for his demons as he was for his voice. Yet somehow, through it all, the music never faltered. No matter how wild the night before, when he stepped into that studio, he delivered. Because deep down, George knew one thing. His voice was the only thing keeping him from fading away completely. But even he couldn't see what was coming next. Because on the horizon, waiting for him in a Nashville studio, was a woman with blonde hair and a voice just as powerful as his. A woman who would change his life forever. And together, they'd make history. It started with a glance across a Nashville studio in 1968. George Jones, the king of heartbreak ballads, and Tammy, country music's rising queen, locked eyes for the first time. The electricity between them was immediate, undeniable. But there was just one problem. They were both married to other people. That didn't stop the pull between them. On stage, their chemistry was pure magic. Off stage, it was even stronger. They tried to resist, but country music thrives on heartache, and their love story was already writing itself in the songs they sang. Fans noticed. The industry whispered. And before long, the whispers became headlines. By 1969, they had left their spouses behind and stepped straight into the biggest scandal country music had ever seen. Nashville was divided. Some called them sinners. Others saw them as country royalty. The fans, they couldn't get enough. And neither could George and Tammy. Their wedding that year wasn't just a union. It was a spectacle. America's favorite country couple, promising forever, their voices blending in perfect harmony. And for a while, it really was a golden age. They weren't just husband and wife. They were a duo taking over the airwaves, topping the charts with songs about love and devotion. But what the world didn't see, what even Tammy didn't realize at first, was that George wasn't just a man in love. He was a man at war. His demons weren't fading. They were growing louder. The more success he had, the more he drank. The deeper he fell for Tammy, the harder he was on himself, convinced he'd never be good enough. The pressure of fame, the weight of his past, it all drove him deeper into the bottle. By the early 1970s, their fairy tale was already unraveling. His drinking became unpredictable. He would disappear for days, missing shows, missing studio sessions, missing life. Promoters started calling him No-Show Jones. At first, it was a joke. Then it became a warning. Tammy did everything she could to hold him together. She canceled gigs to stay home with him. She pleaded, she begged, she even threatened to leave. But addiction doesn't listen to love. And George was slipping away. Then came the night that would turn into one of the most infamous stories in country music history. Tammy had finally put her foot down. No more running off, no more disappearing acts. She took away his car keys, hoping to keep him home, keep him sober. But George Jones was nothing if not determined. And when the thirst hit him, no locked door was going to stop him. That night, he stumbled outside, spotted his only remaining option, and climbed onto a riding lawnmower. For 8 miles, he weaved down the highway, heading straight for the nearest liquor store. By the time Tammy caught up with him, George was leaning against the counter, laughing, a bottle of whiskey in hand. The story spread like wildfire. Fans started showing up to concerts, waving toy lawnmowers. It was funny, until it wasn't. Because behind the laughter, there was a man coming apart at the seams. His drinking wasn't just about numbing pain anymore. It was changing him. He became paranoid, convinced people were out to get him. He accused Tammy of plotting against him, of trying to control him, of taking away his freedom. One night, deep in a drunken haze, he grabbed a shotgun and chased her through their home, ranting about betrayal. Tammy locked herself in a bedroom, shaking, as George raged on the other side of the door. That was the breaking point. By 1975, Tammy had no choice. She filed for divorce, walking away from the man she had tried so hard to save. But even though their marriage was over, their connection wasn't. The love, the pain, the history, it didn't just disappear. When they sang together, even after the divorce, there was something raw, something too real to be faked. Golden Ring, their biggest duet, told the story of a marriage crumbling. The irony? They recorded it just as theirs was falling apart. George never stopped loving her. He just didn't know how to be the man she needed. And without her, he spiraled even deeper. By 1979, the drinking had turned into something even darker. He wasn't just drowning his sorrows anymore, he was feeding his madness. The whiskey wasn't enough, so he turned to cocaine. The paranoia got worse. The hallucinations started. He saw people who weren't there, heard voices whispering things he couldn't understand. At concerts, he'd break into strange voices mid-song, sometimes speaking in the high-pitched squeal of Donald Duck. At one show, he sang an entire set in the cartoon voice, claiming it was the only way to keep the demons quiet. His band looked on in horror. His audience laughed because they didn't realize they were watching a man lose his grip on reality. By the end of 1979, he had burned every bridge. No record label wanted him. No promoter would book him. Even his drinking buddies started backing away, afraid of where he was headed. The money was gone. The houses, the cars, the career, all slipping through his fingers. Then came the night Nashville would never forget. January 1980. A bitter cold wind cut through the streets, frost covering the pavement. And on the side of a highway, a lone figure wandered, muttering to himself, arms wrapped around his chest to fight the freezing air. George Jones. The man who had once commanded arenas was now a shadow, stumbling along the roadside talking to ghosts. He had nothing left. No money, no home, not even a destination. A police officer spotted him, stopped his patrol car, and stepped out. "George?" The voice barely registered. The officer had seen a lot in his years, but nothing prepared him for this. A legend of country music, now unrecognizable, lost in the night, his face hollow, his body shaking from the cold. In his pocket, they found a single folded photograph. George Jones, standing on stage, holding a CMA award. A moment from another lifetime. The officer radioed for help. Nashville woke up to the headlines the next morning. George Jones, found frozen, destitute, alone. The Possum had finally hit rock bottom. There were no more songs left to sing, no more shows to play, no more chances to turn it around. Or so the world thought. Because sometimes, when a man is at his lowest, when everything is lost, something or someone steps in. And for George, that someone was waiting just around the corner. A woman named Nancy. A song called "He Stopped Loving Her Today." And a comeback that would make history. By 1981, George Jones had lost everything. His money, his career, his reputation, gone. The only thing left was his voice, and even that was slipping away. He was a man without direction, drinking himself deeper into oblivion, until one person refused to let him disappear. Her name was Nancy Cedo. She wasn't a singer. She wasn't a producer. She was a woman who saw through the wreckage, who believed there was still something left worth saving. She didn't coddle him. She didn't make excuses. She laid down the law: no more drinking, no more missing shows, no more self-destruction. If he wanted to crawl out of the hole he dug, it was now or never. And for the first time in his life, George listened. Nancy took control. She cut off his access to alcohol, locked him out of bars, stood guard at every turn. He fought it. He resented it. But deep down, he knew she was right. If he didn't change, he was going to die. Then came the song. Billy Sherrill, his producer, had been holding on to a track, one he knew could either revive George's career or bury it for good. It was a song about a man who never stopped loving a woman, not even after death. It was dark, tragic, and brutally real. It was "He Stopped Loving Her Today." George hated it. He said it was too sad, too depressing. He didn't believe people would want to hear something so final. But Billy knew better. He pushed. He insisted. The recording process was a disaster. George was still in the grip of addiction, barely able to stay focused. He'd forget the melody, stumble through verses, argue over the arrangement. It took over a year, multiple producers, and endless patience to get him through it. At one point, he even tried to sing it in his infamous Donald Duck voice, just to spite them. But Nancy was there every single day, keeping him on track. And then, finally, after months of struggle, they had it. When He Stopped Loving Her Today was released, George was convinced it would flop. He couldn't see what everyone else did. He had just recorded a masterpiece. The song didn't just climb the charts, it shattered expectations. It won Song of the Year. Twice. It became the gold standard of country music storytelling, the song that every artist, every fan, would point to for generations to come. George Jones wasn't just back, he was legendary. But a song, no matter how great, wasn't enough to erase the past. If he was going to make this comeback real, he had to prove it. He had to show up. And that's exactly what he did. For the first time in years, he was reliable. He arrived at shows on time, sober, ready to sing. The man who had once been a running joke in the industry was now its elder statesman. The Grand Ole Opry, once hesitant to even book him, welcomed him back with open arms. His first performance there as a sober man was something Nashville would never forget. The crowd stood before he even sang a note, cheering, crying, overwhelmed by the sight of a man they never thought they'd see return. The redemption was real. But the biggest miracle wasn't the awards, the hit records, or even the sold-out shows. It was what Nancy helped him rebuild behind the scenes. He reconciled with his children. He reached out to old friends, repairing relationships he had shattered in his darkest years. Tammy, the woman he had chased away, even sent him a message after his Opry return. "Proud of you, Possum." And the industry? They didn't just accept him back, they honored him. The Kennedy Center recognized him as a national treasure. Young artists like Randy Travis, Alan Jackson, and Garth Brooks called him their greatest influence. Even legends outside of country music, Elvis Costello, Bob Dylan, Keith Richards, sang his praises. He had once been Nashville's cautionary tale. Now, he was its greatest comeback story. Through the 90s and into the 2000s, George didn't slow down. He kept touring, kept recording, kept proving to the world that he wasn't done. His album I Lived to Tell It All wasn't just a title, it was a statement. Because against all odds, he had survived. In 1999, he faced one more test, a near-fatal car crash. The headlines screamed relapse, but this time, they were wrong. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't high. He had simply lost control of his car. As he lay in the wreckage, barely conscious, paramedics heard something incredible. George Jones was singing to himself, whispering the lyrics to "He Stopped Loving Her Today." He survived. Again. The 2000s brought more accolades, more honors. His song, Choices, a reflection on his turbulent life, won him a Grammy. But mainstream country radio refused to play it. When Alan Jackson took the stage at the CMA Awards, he protested by stopping his own song midway and launching into Choices. The crowd erupted. George Jones had become more than a singer. He was a symbol of real country music. And through it all, Nancy stood by his side. The woman who had once found him on the brink of ruin had given him a second chance at life. By 2013, he had planned one last tour, the final bow. But fate had other plans. On April 26, 2013, George Jones passed away at the age of 81. The country music world stood still. At his funeral, Alan Jackson stepped onto the stage at the Grand Ole Opry House and did the impossible. He sang, "He Stopped Loving Her Today," through tears. The song that had once saved George Jones was now saying goodbye to him. But legends don't die. His records still spin. His voice still echoes. And that old lawnmower? It sits in the Country Music Hall of Fame, a reminder that even in the wildest, darkest times, redemption is possible. George Jones didn't just make a comeback, he became country music's greatest story. A story of talent, pain, loss, and, in the end, a hard-won redemption. By the 1990s, George Jones had defied the odds. He had come back from the brink, outlived his demons, and reclaimed his place as country music's greatest voice. But life wasn't done writing his story just yet. In 1995, something happened that nobody saw coming. George and Tammy reunited. Not in love, not in marriage, but in music. Time had softened the wounds between them, and when they stepped into the studio one last time, something magical happened. Their voices, still perfectly matched, still carrying the weight of everything they had been through, wove together like no time had passed. Their duet, One, wasn't just a song, it was closure. A final chapter in a love story that had been as painful as it was legendary. Tammy's health was failing, and just 3 years later, she was gone. George took the news hard. He had spent years chasing, loving, and losing her. And now, there were no more second chances. At her funeral, he sat quietly, head bowed, knowing that despite everything, she had been a part of him that no one else could ever replace. But life kept moving, and so did George. Then came 1999, the car crash, the moment that nearly ended it all. Driving home from a visit with Nancy, he lost control of his SUV, crashing into a concrete bridge. The wreck was so bad, many thought he wouldn't survive. The media speculated, had he relapsed? Was this the end of George Jones? But when the truth came out, it shocked everyone. He had been sober. No alcohol, no drugs. Just a simple mistake that nearly cost him his life. As he lay in the hospital, broken ribs, punctured lungs, bruised but alive, he did what he had always done. He sang. Quietly, under his breath, he hummed the song that had saved him once before. He stopped loving her today. He recovered, but something changed in him. He knew his time was running short, and he had one last thing to say. Choices. It was a song that laid everything bare. His regrets, his mistakes, his triumphs. He had lived hard, lost plenty, but in the end, he had survived. The song won him a Grammy, but radio stations refused to play it. They said it was too real, too slow, too raw. George didn't care. At the CMA Awards that year, Alan Jackson stood on stage, about to perform a different song, when he did something nobody expected. He stopped mid-performance, looked out at the audience, and with nothing but a single acoustic guitar, began singing Choices. It was a statement, a protest, a moment of pure country rebellion, and the crowd erupted in applause. George was no longer just a country singer, he was a symbol of what country music was supposed to be. Through the 2000s, he became the elder statesman of the genre. Young artists lined up just to shake his hand, to tell him he had shaped their music, their careers, their lives. Garth Brooks, Keith Urban, Vince Gill, they all looked up to him. Even outside country music, he had fans in the unlikeliest places. Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones called him the greatest singer in history. Bob Dylan said no one could tell a story through song like George Jones. But no matter how much the world changed, George stayed the same. He wasn't interested in pop country, in flashy productions. He was a man of steel guitars and heartbreak ballads. When asked what he thought about modern country, he famously said, "I don't do rap, and I can't yodel." In 2013, George Jones took the stage for the last time. The Grand Ole Opry, the place where legends are made. He was scheduled to sing one song, but when the crowd rose to their feet before he even opened his mouth, he knew he wasn't going anywhere just yet. He sang 3 songs that night. And the last one? He stopped loving her today. He delivered it with everything he had left, every note, every ache, every memory. And as he held that final note, the audience stood in silence, knowing they had just witnessed the end of an era. Just weeks later, on April 26, 2013, George Jones was gone. The news spread like wildfire. Tributes poured in from every corner of the music world. Fans left flowers outside the Grand Ole Opry. Radio stations played his songs on repeat. His funeral was held at the very place he had made history, the Opry House. Alan Jackson, tears in his eyes, stepped up to the microphone and did the impossible. He sang, "He Stopped Loving Her Today," as the country music world wept. But legends don't die. George Jones's voice still echoes through every honky-tonk, every jukebox, every broken heart that turns to country music for comfort. His records still spin, his songs still cut deep. And that old lawnmower? It sits in the Country Music Hall of Fame, right next to his gold records and his Kennedy Center honors. A reminder that even in the wildest, darkest times, redemption is always possible. Because George Jones wasn't just a country singer, he was country music, a voice that will never be forgotten.